Welcome, everybody. I am absolutely delighted to moderate this event tonight. I'm here in my function as the chair of the German department, Claudia Breger. But yeah, we're here to celebrate my colleague, Annie Pfeifer, or respectively celebrate her with her first book today. Seen it. To the collector belong the spoils, Modernism and the Art of Appropriation. Annie has been in our department since 2019 after visiting stints at, in Tufts, Rutgers, and Bern, Switzerland. She got her PhD from Yale in 2015. Yeah, has now been working here. Again, this is her first monograph, but she has a number of other publications, including a co-edited collection on walking in Robert Walser and a range of articles, one of them also on walking from a gender angle, very interestingly, but also on other topics like orphans, Iranian-German encounters, and of course work related to this book, which we are about to hear more about, with its focus on modernism on the one hand, material culture and poetics, prominently including Walter Benjamin, but also connections that Annie is making as she's going along to contemporary controversies around museums and collecting against the backdrop of colonial histories, appropriation and questions of hoarding, including in the digital age and format. We have 3 respondents today, each of whom get to speak for 8 minutes, and I'm going to briefly introduce them all now so that we can then go along. Cristina Mendicino is going to start. She's an associate professor and chair of German and Brown University. Has studied theater, German studies, classics and comparative literature at Yale, as well as in Tübingen in Germany, in Bonn, and in Frankfurt am Main. She completed her PhD in German studies at Yale University in 2012. Publications include The Prophecies of Language, The Confusion of Tongues in German Romanticism, 2017, and then Announcements on Novelty, 2020, and most recently, just out, I heard Passive Voices, and the subtitle is very long, and I do not have to have it together. You can tell us later. Andreas Hüssen, the second respondent, really truly needs no introduction in this room, but yeah, for the sake of format, he is the Willard Professor Emeritus of German and Comparative Literature here at Columbia, has been here for a very long time, and is known beyond the department for many reasons, but including as the founding director of the Center for Comparative Literature and Society, as well as one of the founding editors of New German Critique. I'm delighted that he's joining us tonight for the second time this semester. The first occasion was celebrating Andreas's own most recent book on memory art in the contemporary world, confronting violence in the global South. Of the long list of his earlier distinguished publications, I'll just mention 2: After the Great Divide, Modernism, Mass Culture, and Postmodernism, and Twilight Memories, Marking Time in a Culture of Amnesia. Finally, Bruce Robbins, the Old Dominion Foundation professor in the humanities, also needs slightly more introduction because he's from a different building on campus here. But he has also been around for a very, very long time and served as the co-editor, among other things, of the renowned journal Social Text. His many book publications include, most recently also not quite as just, but almost just out, his contribution to humanities reading debates, criticism and politics, a polemical introduction, as well as The Beneficiary, 2017, along with several seminal contributions on questions of cosmopolitanism and internationalism, and titles and subtitles. Again, there's a long list, but things such as, for example, A Literary History of the Welfare State. Again, I'm delighted to have everyone here. Each of them, Annie gets to speak first to talk about her book and introduce it, and then we will have the 3 respondents. And my primary task will be to keep time and make sure that everybody uses the mic, because we also have people online, so that is very crucial.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, great. I was trying to think about the last time I was up here speaking, and I think it was at my job talk in 2019. So it's great to be back here in a different circumstance. And first of all, before I begin, I'd like to start off by thanking our distinguished panelists, Claudia Breger, Andreas Husin, Bruce Robbins, and Christina Mendocino, for being here today and offering their comments. I've long admired all of your work, so it's a real privilege to be here with you in conversation. I'm also very grateful to the Heyman Center for organizing this event, especially Lindsay Schramm, Erin Fay, and Sylvia Grindig, as well as Shireen Alexander and Kirsten Hoffman in the German department. I'd also like to thank the many people in the room who helped shape this book, from my esteemed colleagues and mentors to my students, family, and friends joining the conversation via Zoom. And a special thanks to my amazing research assistant, Devin Friedrich, who is sitting on the side, who is a graduating senior and German major and contributed so much to bringing this book over the finish line. Much of this book was written during the pandemic, when all the archives and libraries were closed and any in-person gathering seemed unfathomable. So it's especially gratifying to be here today to celebrate with you all in person and to see my book as a physical object instead of a jumbled hoard of files and tabs on my screen. And I'll get to that in just a minute. I was just interviewed for a podcast on the book, and the first question I was asked is what I collect. This question comes up all the time. It seems to be a sort of, people all automatically seem to assume that collecting is a kind of autobiographical pursuit. And so my response is, I'd always thought of myself as a collector until I wrote this book, and I realized I was actually more of a hoarder. Which, you know, I think probably goes with the territory. I'm a paper hoarder, and that's primarily what hoarding is. According to the latest DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which classified hoarding now as its own category rather than a subset of what it used to be linked to, which is OCD, the most commonly hoarded items are related to paper, newspapers, magazines, and books, mail, and paperwork. So you can see here so many of the examples of hoarding, apart from, you know, the sort of lurid TV shows that capture hoarding. A lot of hoarding is actually really just paper related. So I still have all my undergraduate notebooks and trips from receipts and tickets from every trip I've taken. But what I really am is an unabashed digital hoarder, a hoarder of files, photos, emails, and even tabs. This is not my desktop, I promise. And we can talk more about digital hoarding, because that's essentially, I think, where my interests are currently at as I'm thinking about the project. So like a true hoarder, I can't fully abandon this project yet. And I'm currently thinking about how categories of hoarding and collecting function in the digital sphere, which is also the subject of my afterword. The distinctions between saving, hoarding, and collecting are increasingly nebulous in the infinitely expanding universe in the information age. And I think you can really see the way the aesthetic is very similar between the sort of physical and the digital hoarding and the sort of clutter. So while my book is mostly confined to the material realm, I continue to think about its implication for the digital world, where many of these questions around saving and archiving are still being worked out. In my own book, I wanted to think about the collector as a creative, even revolutionary figure, rather than simply an old-fashioned antiquarian. I sought to examine not only the author as a collector, but the collector as an author. On a basic level, writing has always been integral to collecting. The rationale and coherence of collections depend on catalogs that describe and archive their objects. But a collection can also be thought of as a narrative, constructed through the objects it contains, and the collector a figure for the author, who tries to create and control a world in miniature. So my book traces three author collectors, Henry James, Walter Benjamin, and Carl Einstein, and the way they engage with collecting as a literary and material practice. Each of the three books, each of the three sections here, of the book connects the author's material collection, which is the first chapter, with his literary technique of collection, which is the second chapter, arguing that they were mutually reinforcing processes. James was a paper hoarder. Benjamin collected toys. I can show you some of Benjamin's toys. Happy to talk more about them in the Q&A. And Einstein was a renowned collector of African art. These are some images from his own art collection. Significantly, none of the items that are here are still extant. Many of the collections were abandoned or dissolved, partly due to the tragic circumstances around Einstein and Benjamin's life. Fleeing the Nazis, they had to get rid of many of their possessions. So what I really had to do in my work is also kind of recreate the collection based on photographic and archival materials, since the objects themselves were no longer there. These authors embraced a modernist style of collecting that reimagines the relationship between author and text, source and medium, not as derivative or imitative, but as a form of creative appropriation. The synthesis between art production and collecting practices is a defining feature of modernist collections. And this is really epitomized in Benjamin's Arcades project, as well as Einstein's document. That's an image from Einstein's document, which incorporated their finds into their text. The collection of these authors can no longer be distinguished from their work, raising the question, where does the collection end and the work of the art begin? Had the author become a collector, or had the collector become an author? Through this lens, collecting becomes a dynamic, future-oriented process of creation, instead of merely a means to preserve the past. And this is, I think, an angle that often gets left out of discussions on museums and archives and other institutional collections. While the collecting impulse in modernism is certainly not limited to James, Einstein, and Benjamin, and I can talk more about my choice of authors later, these three authors mediate between the literary and material worlds, self-consciously reflecting on their creative process as a form of collecting. They all use methods like compiling, interpolating, paraphrasing, and transforming existing texts. Part of what I try to do in my book is to parse out the various dimensions of collecting with all of their cultural associations, to think about why collecting is sometimes an imprecise label for the activity that's happening. So each chapter also introduces a negative model of collecting, a negative in quotation marks, of course, hoarding, rag picking, gleaning, and cultural appropriations. These models are interconnected even as collecting is socially validated, and its cousins, shady cousins, are deemed pathological, unhygienic, or even destructive. I have a long section on gleaning, which was central to the work of Walter Benjamin, who thought of himself as a literary rag picker, rummaging through the waste of the other authors who wrote before him. And here he very much models himself on the Parisian rag picker going through the city at night, collecting the garbage that the city casts off. This is part of what makes collecting a radical political and artistic act for Benjamin. So ultimately, my book thinks about collecting as a dialectical practice. To preserve an object, we have to kill or destroy it by taking it out of its context. Collecting is simultaneously revolutionary and reactionary, destructive insofar as the original object is transfigured or destroyed, and creative insofar as it assembles new objects. Walter Benjamin highlights this very dynamic when he warns that the collector is, quote, motivated by dangerous though domesticated passions, gefährlich wenn auch domestizierten Passionen. The dangerous passion highlights the roots of collecting in the instinct to dominate, appropriate, and despoil. On a most basic level, and here's just a few words about spoil since it's so central also to my title. On a most basic level, spoils are goods, property, or territory that are seized by force, often in a time of war. This book establishes a genealogy of collecting and spoliation, the appropriation of the work or property of others. I borrow this word from James, who self-consciously employs the discourse of spoils throughout his work by blending its appropriative and creative dimensions. And part of what I'm arguing is that James was actually much more cognizant of the sort of dangers of collecting than more sort of traditionally radical or revolutionary thinkers like Benjamin and Carl Einstein. Throughout this book, spoils have a similar valence. They carry both the specter of destruction and the promise of renewal and transformation. Modernism was creative in its propensity to collect, appropriate, and transform, and spoliation helps to see it from a new angle. At the same time, acknowledging the creativity of certain forms of appropriation does not mean glossing over their political or ethical ramifications. Spoils ultimately gesture back to the origins of collecting, namely the triumphant display of the victor's loot. And this is, I think, very much still at stake in many of the museums that we visit today. James's wealthy American collectors plundered Europe in search of culture. Benjamin admitted actually himself that he was ransacking the French Bibliothèque Nationale to get his quotations in the Arcades project. But Einstein is the most direct example of the way that modern collections continue to be furnished by spoils of colonization. In fact, his mania for African art developed during his appointment in the Belgian colonial office, underscoring again, I think, the close ties between European empire and modern art. Recent discussions in European and American museums about the restitution of the Benin bronzes and other looted artifacts reveal the violent colonial forces which underpin collecting. And we had a series, I think, of interesting talks over the last month, which really sort of tease out the multiple angles of appropriation, from Andreas Hussen's work to the presentation by Stefan Willer we had last, right before spring break, which talked about the Humboldt Forum as a kind of modern museum with all these controversies at stake. So collecting has a fraught, bloody history, which is now only starting to be unpacked. So thank you very much. I look forward to your comments and discussion afterwards. Thank you so much.
Thank you for this book, which is truly a gift, and the additional gift of being invited to think with you and prepare this response. Any Pfeifers to the collector belong the spoils, modernism, and the art of appropriation begins with a critical instance of displacement and condensation. The commonplace to the victor belong the spoils is reformulated such that the collector comes to occupy the place of the victor, while the art of appropriation in its proximity to modernism at once evokes the literary and visual works associated with modernist art, as well as the technical skill that is more usually signified in countless other phrases concerning the art of something. In this way, Annie's title does not merely give readers a first inkling of the claims that will be made concerning the politically charged role of collection in modernist artistic production, but also the precision with which her book is composed. With the last phrase of her title alone, Annie points to the changing character of artistic production that she will trace through the exemplary oeuvres of James, Benjamin, and Einstein. Whereas many of their predecessors in the 19th century European literary tradition went, I quote, to great lengths to stage themselves as literary geniuses, these self-conscious author collectors were, she writes, groundbreaking in their transformative techniques. By gathering objects and texts, they refashioned their finds into new works, end quote. In this way, art, in the seemingly more creative sense of the word, thus becomes an art of appropriation. And to this one might add, as an art that consists in appropriating, it exposes the furthest consequences of the expropriation that, as Jacques Derrida had argued, is presupposed with each proper claim, insofar as no utterance or artwork could be associated with a proper name, if the work and name alike were not already separated from their nominal source. When creation takes place as curation, to borrow an ingenious formulation from Pfeiffer's introduction, the public domain to which each artist and artistic presentation is structurally addressed is made pronounced as their condition of possibility as well. Yet insofar as the comportment of collectors towards their respective materials varies widely, and insofar as the area of what I have provisionally called the public domain is demarcated according to shifting structures of economic and political power,
The turn from private collection to public presentation pivots in each case, as Annie so brilliantly shows, upon the nexus of relations that makes art and appropriation possible in the first place. It is to the violent history of those relations that the spoils of Annie's titles speak, and that she underscores from the outset of her introduction. I quote again, "Collecting is a conflicted practice torn between preservation and transformation. It preserves its objects by stripping them from their original context and importing them into a new framework," end quote. As both spoils and stripping suggest, the objects of the collections that Annie examines, however different they may otherwise be, share the trait of being spoils, and thus stand too as indices of the violence and loss that are involved each time in their removal into a new context. Annie's attentiveness throughout her book towards such indices as loss, as well as the foundational act of violence that underpins cultural acquisition, render the readings that she offers a critical and urgent reminder of that which archival collections of all kinds register in absentia. To the collector belong the spoils. There is thus an emphasis that I would like to draw out further upon the intersubjective relations that shape not only the practices, but also the objects of collection, and that constitute these objects as signifiers, say, as spoils, in negotiations of desire and loss. The constitutive determinacy of signifiers and the resulting contingency of collected objects upon the signifying orders in which they bear meaning is another way I would submit to read the emphasis that Annie places throughout her book upon context and transformation. Collecting thus becomes a question of linguistic operations as well, aligning it with the subject of literary studies and psychoanalysis, another discourse which Annie invokes at critical moments throughout her book. In order to indicate several further ways in which the subjects and objects of collection solicit analysis at the level of the signifier, I'd like to spend the remainder of this response addressing certain traits of James's Aspern papers that Annie's study has prepared us to retrace. As the title suggests, the signifier that insists in the articulations of desire that structure James's novella is Aspern. This proper name of a poet who suffered an early death, but not too early to have had what the narrator calls both an early and modern phase of his reputation, is the one that confers value to the papers that the modern anonymous narrator seeks to acquire and that the poet's earlier lover, Juliana Bordereau, seeks to keep to herself. At issue in their interactions, which makes up the novel, is most obviously who can lay claim to the legacy of Jeffrey Aspern. But for this very reason, it is also an issue of the effect that the name has upon different subjects, as well as the consequences of their interventions on that name and on themselves. As Annie argues, Juliana Bordereau and the anonymous narrator can be characterized as a hoarder and collector, respectively. They fulfill these roles, however, insofar as their desires are attached to the same name, and for this reason, their gestures of hoarding and collecting are subject to the permutations and displacements to which each signifier is constitutively exposed. Juliana Bordereau, to be sure, remains resolved to keep all things pertaining to her relationship with Aspern out of public circulation, as Annie has emphasized, whether it be an issue of the papers that she hides in her bed, or even her eyes, whose magnificence Aspern once praised and whose appearance she now covers with a green shade so as to preserve them. But these very gestures also incessantly speak of Aspern, giving her and him away with the same intensity with which she seeks to suppress or withhold every word of the poet. Even her characteristic comportment, described in the text as peremptory, coarse, rude, and abrupt, is nothing if not asper, if I may refer to the obsolete Latin adjective signifying rough, harsh, or severe, which is also to say Juliana Bordereau incorporates Aspern and figures herself among the Aspern materials that she seeks to guard. It is, as Annie has shown, a matter of reification, but also I would suggest incorporation as well. Aspern thus insists through the operations and aspirations of Juliana Bordereau, but there is another related complication that the dynamic of hoarding and within the dynamic of hoarding and collecting that plays out at the level of the signifier in James's novella. Insofar as Juliana Bordereau is named in Aspern's poems and will thus be called Aspern's Juliana, beyond them as well, marking her proper name, like her proper eyes, as the property of the poet, his name is also contaminated with hers. This contamination is made explicit even before they are named, when Juliana and by extension her niece, Tina Bordereau, are introduced as persons whose name, I quote, has been mixed up for ages before with one of the greatest names of the century, end quote. With this intimate, albeit nominal association, no desire for the relics of aspirin could exclude a slippage in orientation towards such a terrible relic as the aunt Juliana Bordereau as well. This mix-up of the names arguably leads to a hesitation that holds the narrator in the house of the Bordereaux. On the one hand, he harbors the expressed desire to arrive at the papers, or as it says in James's Revised New York edition, to arrive at the spoils. Yet on the other hand, the narrator is prepared to dwell where he has already arrived for at least 3 months before taking any other initiative besides sending the Bordereau women flowers from the garden that he cultivates on their property. For although Jeffrey Aspirin had never been in the house, some note of his voice seemed to abide there, the narrator claims, by a roundabout implication, a faint reverberation, end quote. Remaining in the house thus gives the narrator proximity by proxy to his nominal idol, whose literary remains, however, he cannot acquire, collect, or publish so long as he merely remains in the Bordereau house. There is not sufficient time for me to dwell upon more of the ways in which what I would call the Bordereau aspirin complex structures the objects and subjects of collection in James's novella. But in order to conclude, I would like to offer a brief commentary upon its constitutive significance for the one object that the narrator does acquire as a result of his stay at the Bordereaux, namely the portrait of Jeffrey Aspirin that Juliana Bordereau shows the narrator in one decisive scene and that her niece Tina gives the narrator after the death of her aunt, who expires shortly after catching the narrator attempting to pry into her secretary, or as it is also called in one passage, her bureau. In the last lines of the novella, the narrator confesses that the portrait hangs above his writing table, just as he had previously claimed Aspirin to hang high in the heavens of our literature for all the world to see. He thus appears to be left with a relic of Aspirin. But insofar as the portrait is the work of Juliana Bordereau's father, a painter, the spoils that the narrator comes to possess are not only in Aspirin, but also, as conventional diction would have it, a Bordereau. The object is marked by both of the names that had been mixed up from the outset of the text. And insofar as the narrator does not publicize his possession for all the world to see, but instead keeps it over his private writing table, his comportment towards the object resembles that of Juliana Bordereau more closely than it resembles the prying publisher who he had been before. The subject of this minimal private collection, in other words, is arguably not entirely the same subject as the one who had pursued Aspirin's papers at the outset. Nor are the spoils from the narrator's quest at the Bordereau household an unadulterated relic of Aspirin. The desires and the name of Juliana Bordereau persist in this other scene, however far Aspirin's portrait may seem to have come from her Venetian home, and however removed she may seem to have become as a result of her death. Both the narrator of the Aspirin papers and the portrait that he collects are, I would like to suggest, collective formations, shaped by the operations with signifiers that are as such proper to none, but that instead subject all involved to displacement, condensation, contamination, and alteration. From what I gathered in rereading James with and through Annie's book, collecting solicits reading, not only to glean what collecting makes out of its objects, to remember the losses that spoil each supposed victory, or to revise our understanding of modernist art, but also to address what it makes of its subjects, as well as the language in which we share. Thank you.
I first met Annie on email in 2014 when she submitted an essay on Benjamin to New German Critique. It was entitled Between Antiquarianism and the Avant-Garde, Benjamin's Conflicted Collector. The article appeared too many years later, thanks for your patience, Annie, under the changed but equally telling title, A Collector in a Collectivist State, Walter Benjamin's Russian Toy Collection. It thus gave me great pleasure to re-encounter this essay as a chapter of her deeply thought book, To the Collector Belong the Spoils. This is a timely book in several senses. At a time when art collecting is increasingly dominated by neoliberal financialization of the art markets, and archival collecting has been radically transformed, as Annie suggested, by digital technologies, the focus on three individual modernist collectors, Henry James, Walter Benjamin, and Carl Einstein, offers a salutary reminder that, like everything else, the culture of collecting has a history, from the early modern Wunderkammer through the 19th century creation of the Universal Museum, much of it, of course, based on despoliation, plunder, and theft, to the modernist transformations of collecting all the way to the present day. The book is timely in the sense that it reflects on individual and institutional collecting as major cultural practices, representing and shaping shifting conceptions of time and space. Annie's lucid writing provides a both subtle and robust entry into the political and aesthetic issues at stake. Sensitive to the power asymmetries in and between cultures, the book offers key insights into the complexities of cultural appropriation, a concept that is often bandied about these days in extremely reductive ways. But first and foremost, this book is about collecting as a conflictual practice, pitting preservation against transformation, antiquarianism against creativity, salvation against radical change. The collector emerges as a paradigmatic figure, not unlike the figures of the flaneur or the rag picker being described as the underbelly of collecting. Both, the collector emerges as a paradigmatic figure of both social modernity and aesthetic modernism. The subtitle of the book, Modernism and the Art of Appropriation, gets at the umbilical cord that pertains between social modernity, its phantasms of power and conquest on the one hand, and the aesthetic dimensions of modernism, grounded in practices of collage, montage, fragmentation, and so forth. Normally, when we think of modernism, we think of Ezra Pound's demand, make it new, or Rimbaud's Il faut être absolument moderne. Annie's focus on the collector imaginary in James, Benjamin, and Einstein reveals this cliché as one-sided, if not obsolete. It is the author as collector rather than producer who emerges here. In this way, the book also participates in the ongoing reassessments of 20th century modernisms and the legacies they have bequeathed to us and to the world. The art of collecting, appropriating, collaging, montaging, and citing characterizes both the newness of modernist art in its time and its reliance on inherited materials from the past. Now, each of Annie's three author collectors is given 2 chapters in the book. The first on their specific modes of collecting, hoarding, rag picking, and appropriating. The second on their writerly practice of compiling, montaging, citing, and constructing, that which qualifies them as modernist authors. All 3 of them saw the creative process itself as a form of appropriation. Let me quote Annie from the first chapter. Gleaning, compiling, and transforming existing materials, these authors embraced a modernist style of collecting that reimagined the relationship between author and text, source and medium, not as derivative and imitative, but as a form of creative appropriation, end quote. Quite stunning is the finding, and Annie mentioned that James, in his presentation of collectors, seems to have been more aware of the potential violence of appropriation than either Benjamin or Einstein, the 2 Marxists, were in their reflections on collecting. James's fiction shows clearly how American millionaires bought up and plundered European cultural treasures, and how collecting itself can result in dehumanization. Just think of Isabel Archer in The Portrait of a Lady. Whereas Einstein, author of an important work on negaplastic, criticized ethnographic practices of decontextualization, sailing under the flag of primitivism, he himself valued African sculpture as decontextualized aesthetic form only, thus erasing cultural and historical specificity of his African cultural objects and their provenance. Progressive in his first move, the second one remains subject to the critique of decontextualization, which he himself had voiced against ethnography. The battles in which Einstein engaged have risen, of course, to public consciousness again in recent debates about the legacies of colonialism, restitution, redress, and reparations. Now, there's so much more to be said about each of these chapters, but let me limit myself here to Benjamin's Moscow Diary. When I first read Annie's Benjamin essay years ago, I was struck by the persuasive way in which she makes sense of the riddle the Moscow Diary has posed to many of its readers. Benjamin, whose close to 2-month trip to Moscow in the winter of 1926 and 27 the trip meant to establish relations with Russian intellectuals, deepen his commitment to communism, and rekindle his sexual affair with Latvian Bolshevik Asialatses, whom he had first met earlier in Italy. But all these projects, all of this, as is well known, resulted in a failure on all 3 fronts. Hampered by his ignorance of the Russian language and frustrated by Asia's reluctance to re-engage, he instead focused on collecting Russian toys from the pre-industrial area. As he was wandering around, rather forlorn in the street markets of the Soviet capital. This only comes into full view as Annie reads the Moscow Diary together with a diverse collection of short and mostly ignored scattered texts by Benjamin about Russian toys, child's play, and children's literature. The incipient communist was engaged, in other words, in the primordial bourgeois activity of collecting, while Russia was in the throes of collectivization. His well-known focus on childhood and on the power of children's play, one of his affective and intellectual links with Asialatses, energized this obsession, which, as Annie argues, seems more of an escape from Soviet realities and from the shipwrecked relationship with Asia than anything else. But to me, it remains somewhat of an open question whether Benjamin's turn to historical materialism is indeed already prefigured, as you argue, Annie, in this early collecting work. The pursuit of the Russian toy collection still seems to be too invested in a romantic, partly Tolstoyan celebration of the linkage child, peasant, proletarian. It seems more concerned with salvation of cultural residues than with revolutionary change, which indeed, as you argue correctly, becomes central in his later work on Eduard Fuchs, the Marxist collector of caricatures and erotica. After all, you yourself point to the antiquarianism of Benjamin's collecting desire, which to me seems closer to the historicism Benjamin later shunned than to historical materialism. It's hard to fathom what collecting pre-industrial toys might have to do with Lenin's definition of communism as Soviet power plus the electrification of the whole country. And I would perhaps ask whether one couldn't even find a dimension of a romantic anti-communism in the Moscow Diary when Benjamin laments in Siegeszug der Technik the obsession of technology with technology in Soviet Russia. But be that as it may, Annie's writing illustrates marvelously how desire, even the mania of collecting, distinguishes the individual collector from institutional and museal collecting ventures. But overall, the book demonstrates that more than just producing an archive or a taxonomy, modernist collecting practice became a radical creative endeavor. The artist as collector, the collector as artist. And this is true, as she shows, for Benjamin's Passagenwerk, the Arcades project, as it is for Einstein and Bataille's writing project of Documents from the late 1920s. It's a riveting and brilliant exploration of modernist collecting. To the collector belongs the spoils is a marvelous and challenging book, unusually broad in scope and conceptually rich for a first book. Now, my questions, very quickly, apart from the question whether you perhaps project Benjamin's historical materialism from the Geschichtsphilosophische Thesen onto his Moscow collecting project, I'm not sure myself how to deal with that issue. I wonder if you might have a comment on our current museum world, which you suggest, of course, in your introductory comments as well. You speak persuasively in the book of the artist as collector, the collector as artist. Many current art projects come to mind as centered on collecting, on archiving, remembering and compiling, projects which after reading your book seem quite traditional suddenly, and in the tradition of modernism itself. Or have we perhaps reached yet another stage of this conundrum when today the museum curator is increasingly seen as artist, and when contemporary artists are tasked with recurating, though often temporarily only, extant museum collections? But this, of course, opens a whole other dimension in the history of collecting, and I look forward to your work on that in the future.
The first thing that fascinated me in this very fascinating book was the title, which you've heard a number of times now, To the Collector Belong the Spoils. As you know, as Christina said, this title plays on the saying, to the victor belong the spoils. So for the purposes of this book, the collector is like a victor in a competition, or more likely a war. A Google search of the word spoils gives you references to political patronage or the spoils system, among other things. But since the original meaning of spoils, as the book reminds us, is goods, property, or territory that are seized by force, often in a time of war, war seems the dominant paradigm. Add to this art and appropriation in the subtitle, that is, art as appropriation, or as the taking of someone else's property, the violation of someone else's property rights. And it seems clear that what the book is asking is whether modernism, or maybe art in general, is fundamentally immoral or amoral. Which makes me ask, in turn, how far the book wants to go, or should want to go, into the darkness of that vision. It's a high culture version, a sort of non-reductive version of the pop culture reductive question, what about artists who are monsters? As in the Todd Field movie Tar, or Claire Diderot's book Monsters, or one might say in cancel culture. If you want to talk about this, this will bring down the level of the conversation considerably from where we are. One piece of evidence that this is not where the book wants to go, or the only place it wants to go, comes from its use of the collector, and Christina referred to this, in an argument against artistic originality. The argument that all art, like collecting, is really a rearrangement of already existing materials. This argument, that art is a rearrangement of already existing materials, fits one asymmetry in the book. The fact that the collector equals victor equation doesn't work equally well in all three of the cases that the book deals with. I think it's much less relevant to the Baudelaire rag picker model in Benjamin. In the middle section of the book devoted to Benjamin, what's collected and aesthetically repurposed is refuse that has been discarded. Refuse that has been discarded does not have to be seized by force from any prior possessor. It's not a violation of somebody else's private property rights. I note in passing that Annie decided not to proceed as she could have, as Martin Puchner does in his recent book, Culture, the Story of Us, by questioning whether anyone should be understood as having property rights to culture at all. That question would also lower the level of conversation if you are interested in going there. I note also that if one wanted to make a case that the artist as rag picker is also the victor in a war, you would probably have to identify the antagonist over whom the collector artist is victorious. And here I'm playing a little bit. The antagonist would have to be time, since it's time that perpetually threatens all human objects and projects with dissolution and non-existence. It's time that the collector is at least potentially victorious over in this case. But if this argument is worth making at all, it would be necessary to add in this context, and here I'm indulging a certain tendency to be polemical, that the collector would be assuming that time is, after all, linear, as is the vision of history in Benjamin's Angel of History reading of the clay painting. History as an ever-increasing pile of ruins. Everybody knows it, everybody quotes it. It seems interesting to me that the linearity of that paradigm is almost always taken for granted, even by those who assume, and everyone does assume, that Benjamin is refuting a linear historicist model of time, and correctly so. The theory of history as cumulative ruination in the reading of the clay painting is just as linear as the progressive model that Benjamin calls historicist and is supposedly rejecting. This point seems worth insisting on in a discussion of a book called To the Collector Belong the Spoils, because the title itself guides the reader into a counter-argument. Once upon a time, the spoils system of political patronage was considered natural, normal, inevitable, and legitimate. With the establishment of a more or less independent civil service, that is no longer the case, or at any rate, it's much less the case than it used to be. More to the point, there has been what I would describe, you can argue with me afterwards, as linear progress in the domain of violence, and in particular, the violent appropriation of spoils, booty, or in a word that English borrowed from German in the period of the 30 Years' War, plunder. As Eve Winter shows in an essay called Conquest, until some point in the modern period, conquest was understood to confer upon the conqueror the legitimate right to rule territory that had been conquered. Taking territory by force was morally acceptable. It was even applauded. It's how you got to be called great. There was no ethical objection to being a conqueror and bringing home the spoils. Today, conquests are still happening, of course, but the moral landscape has changed. Changed, I would say, for the better. Conquest is no longer accepted as legitimate, let alone applauded. This is an example of history that would have to be described as linear history that, in my opinion, ought to be factored in when Benjamin's Angel of History reading is greeted with such thunderous and unanimous applause. I dare say this among scholars of German. Among the issues of literary theory that the book vivified for me, I would like to single out its attentiveness to the issue of context versus decontextualization. Context versus decontextualization is, of course, a particular issue for modernism, as Annie shows, but it also points up one sense in which, as has often been said, literary criticism in the Anglophone world, at least, can be considered a modernist discipline. To put this question in another way, what is the history that the curator or critic either should put art into or is involved in taking art out of? How do we see our own function as critics? Do we see ourselves as decontextualizing and recontextualizing, arranging so as to create new effects that answer to new needs? Or is our responsibility to restore the context around texts as if to restore them to their rightful owners, if indeed ownership is the right model for the claim that the past makes on the artifacts it produced? So are past texts properly seen as the past's possessions? Are critics in the present violating the rights of the past, despoiling it? I think Annie and I are on the same page in wanting to cast at least some doubt on the private property model as applied to the past. finding uses for trash that has been discarded as useless, heavy quotation marks around trash, seems a better model here than theft. So here I bring in evidence, what I see, maybe wrongly, as the subtle, almost hidden arc that structures Annie's book. I think there is an arc, but she's here to tell me I'm wrong. As I read it, simplifying enormously materials that are always presented with much more precision, the book starts with Henry James and James's moral critique of barbarous appropriation. And it ends with Carl Einstein. It could have ended with Einstein's complicity with European colonialism, with Einstein's case for the aesthetic value of African art, a case that depended on its aesthetic decontextualization, as Andreas was saying. It could have ended with Einstein's self-critique, that is, his shift away from aesthetic decontextualization and his project of restoring African artifacts to their functional symbolic significance in their cultures of origin. But that's not where it ends. Where it does choose to end is with Einstein's critical dictionary. The critical dictionary deals with words rather than with material artifacts. Unlike material artifacts, words cannot be owned and therefore cannot be stolen. If there is an allegory of criticism or of art rising up beneath this book's scrupulous scholarly surface, that's the one that has my vote. So, like Andreas, I'm going to end with a couple of questions, which have nothing at all to do with what I just said. So, two anthropological questions for what the anthropological perspective is worth here. Would it make sense to question the category of art anthropologically, something an anthropologist like Talal Asad was obliged to do by the original Rushdie affair? In other words, to see art as a form of Western religion, that Westerners can't presume everyone in the world will respect equally or at all. And what would an ethnographic as opposed to a psychological view of hoarding look like? Here I have the benefit of a former classmate of Annie's, my daughter, being an anthropologist and telling me that I should read Katie Kilroy Marek. Do you know Katie Kilroy Marek? Yeah, she puts psychological treatments of hoarding into anthropological perspective. You will enjoy this. And my last question, what about money? In order to collect, you need to have money.
Thank you so much for these three wonderful responses. Now Annie gets a chance to respond again, and then we will open it up to the audience.
I should stay seated. Okay. Yeah, I think I prefer that. Wow, these are remarkable. Thank you so much. Henry James was famously went back after publishing his books and revised them again. And I'm sort of tempted now, based on all these comments, to want to do the same, to go back and sort of revise and incorporate all these very interesting questions and thoughts. Which is also one of the reasons I think hoarding is so central to James, right? There's a kind of an inability to let go of something, that the churning, the continuous churning that I think categorizes his work is sort of formative also to an understanding of hoarding as an activity. But anyway, so I'll start to try to address some of these questions, and I'm sure I won't get to all of them. And I also look forward to the Q&A, so I want to leave time for that. So just a few sort of central responses. Christine, I'll start with you. I think your reading of the Aspirin papers is really interesting. I actually thought as I was listening to you that there's something very similar going on in the other text that I analyzed at the end of the first chapter, which is The Last of the Valeri, where the end also sort of, the end of the story or the novella closes with this image of a piece of the statue that they had unearthed that he keeps privately in his room, And it's this really interesting moment where there's a kind of private incorporation of some kind of physical artwork that has been collected. And I think that precisely goes to the heart of the sort of difference between hoarding and collecting, which I try to tease out, which is, I think, brilliantly formulated in Orhan Pamuk's Museum of Innocence, where he says, I actually have the quote somewhere. I'll see if I can find it quickly. He says something like, collectors are sort of proud and want to show their objects to the world, versus hoarders who are private and want to keep things for themselves. And he almost sort of seems to differentiate them affectively as a kind of difference in their approach to wanting to either show or keep hidden these objects. And so when I listened to you talk about aspirin papers, I was very much remembering that kind of distinction as something where that kind of incorporation might be precisely where hoarding and collecting are different, right? Whereas the collector wants to show his or her their objects to the world, to sort of exhibit publicly in some sort of, and he actually, or Pamuk also sort of says, collectors are Western, hoarders are Eastern. It's almost a kind of geographic orientation, which I think complicates it a little bit more. But anyway, I was thinking very much of this sort of public-private distinction that you draw. And I think it's really interesting to think about the aspirin papers in that vein. So I was really grateful to you for bringing up that point. And I have lots more to sort of think about in your comments. Andreas, I was very interested in your kind of formulation as the author, as collector rather than producer, which I think sort of shifts, again, the Benjaminian concept. One thing that I'm trying to do, and I think you sort of hit on this point when you cited Ezra Pound's Make It New, right? What is it? You know, it's interesting. It's not make new, or it's not create new, right? It's make it new, which to me sort of suggests very much that there's something already, a pre-existing material that has to be somehow refashioned or appropriated, even in this sort of very modernist moment of thinking through the form of artistic creation. So absolutely, and I think Christina raised this point as well. What I'm really trying to do in some sense is to rethink a kind of model of artistic creation. And this is why I think I start with James too. He's the first, not the first, I think that there's always a danger with firsts, but he's one of the early sort of modernists, or, on the threshold between realism and modernism, who sort of thinks of his artistic practice not as something of akin to this genius collector who sits in a room, or genius creator who sits in a room and comes up with this brilliant artistic idea, right? He thinks of his practice very much as gleaning, as appropriating, and that's the way that he sort of thinks through his artistic practice as something of a kind of methodology. And that's also, I think, why I started with James, because he's sort of the first to see himself in that vein as a kind of a collector of sorts, rather than a kind of genius creator figure. Now, the other question you raised, which is, trying to remember the order here. The other question that you raised about museums is central, but I first wanted to get to the question of historical materialism in the response to the Moscow diary. I think you're absolutely right. The purpose of his visit to Moscow is in some way, obviously, to establish contact with the, communists, the Soviet intellectuals, to form alliances. But what he ends up doing is collecting these objects almost as a sort of reaction to this kind of overstimulating environment that he can't really get a handle on. And I guess my point in sort of linking this to the historical materialist is to suggest that already in this kind of early ethnographic moment, as he's collecting these objects and sort of taking them out of context, and it's quite funny because he's literally running around Moscow going to these different toy stores, and he at one point even pretends like he's buying something for his child. But then it becomes clear it's actually for himself. And there are all these moments where he does this. He's constantly sort of taking toys, which are these kind of functional objects, right, that have a particular purpose. They're toys for play, and re-exhibiting them, sort of taking them out of their context and turning them into these, and I can show, well, I guess the slide shows off, but the toys, is it possible to show the toys really quickly? Because they become, these are toys that then become these sort of museal artifacts, right, through his process of decontextualization. And I think that's exactly what then becomes the issue in Arcade's project, right, is taking things out of their context, their original context, and repurposing them, in this case, children's toys that have a specific pedagogical function. They become these kind of artifacts. And it's interesting too, that he commissioned them right away to be photographed. Even before, they were sent back to Berlin, he wanted them to be photographed, which in my mind, I think has a kind of ethnographic dimension here. And that's why I think in some ways it's important to see this as a kind of precursor to his larger project in the Arcades project, which is decontextualization, which is taking things out of their context. He uses the word herausbringen several times to talk about what it is he's doing. And I think in some ways, the early kind of move to take these toys as kind of spoils of his trip. And he literally at the end of the trip, he's sort of sad and forlorn, packing his suitcase, and he doesn't have any money left. And he realizes that he spent it all on toys as he's going back to Berlin. And so these are literally the spoils of his trip in some sense. And they're kind of spoiled in a double sense because they're also kind of extracted from the world of the child who sort of uses them, right? But I think you're right to sort of put a little more pressure on the historical materialist moment there. But I do think it's also important to sort of see them in this vein. And I like what you said very much about sort of thinking about what he's doing in the Moscow Diary is particularly a kind of romantic, use the word romantic anti-communist or something. I think that's the formulation you use. Right. Yeah. Right. Right, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And it has more to do with, I think, historicism, perhaps, and historical materialism, right? Which is exactly what he's sort of criticizing in the Fuchs essay.
Which does not exactly map onto the sort of standard notions within Marxism of what historical materialism is. So that's where it gets fuzzy, but anyway.
Right. Yes, exactly. And I think it's important to always, even when thinking about Benjamin as a Marxist, to think of him as a very sort of unorthodox Marxist who very much defines or redefines many of the terms that he perhaps borrows from the Marxist framework. To sort of just pick up the other thread that you mentioned, which is the museum. I think the question is really important, right? And we should think about what a museum, the modern museum, looks like, right? Especially vacated from all the spoils. I mean, it's hard to open, the news now without seeing some case of a kind of repatriation of various works of art. Germany recently, I think last year, agreed to return over 1,000 Benin bronzes back to Nigeria. This is happening, in other places as well. The Smithsonian recently returned many objects back to Nigeria through various treaties. And this was also the subject of the talk we heard a few weeks ago. So what might the modern museum look like, right? And how would we think about a kind of modern museum? And here I think, again, I like to quote Orhan Pamuk. For those who haven't been to see his interesting museum in Istanbul, he has an amazing and this is how I end my book with the Museum of Innocence, which is problematic in its own way, but what he does is he sort of writes in tandem a novel and creates a museum alongside it to house the sort of fictional objects that populate his novel. But one thing he says, he actually has a kind of modest manifesto for museums at the end of his museum catalog, and he says, "It is imperative that museums become smaller, more individualistic, and cheaper. This is the only way they will ever tell stories on a human scale. Big museums with their wide doors call upon us to forget our humanity and embrace the state and its human masses." So here I think he sort of points to a different understanding of museums as a storyteller, right? As a kind of a space of storytelling rather than a kind of taxonomic, these grand museums of the 18th and 19th century that aim to sort of display the world. And maybe that's why in part the Berlin Humboldt Forum in some way failed, because it still has these sort of totalizing aspirations that are left out of these smaller museums. And so that's where I think at least Pamuk sees the future of museums is sort of these smaller spaces where you can feel a kind of intimate connection with objects. So I do think a lot about that. And then finally, how are we on time? Sorry. Okay. All right. I do want to also leave time for questions. And then finally, to Bruce's questions about, thank you also very much. I was just thinking it was about 10 years ago that you spoke to us at Yale with the Baldwin Dahl lecture. So again, wonderful to see you here today. And I was thinking a bit about what you mentioned, which is temporality. I mean, temporality is so clearly at stake in all of these models of collecting. And I like to think about, I liked your formulation of thinking about time as in some ways the enemy. And if I think about kind of especially the Benjaminian gleaning, rag picking, what it is also a kind of an effort. So of course you have collecting as a form of salvaging objects, right? Taking them out of time. And this is very much, I think, the ethnographic impulse in collecting. But with rag picking, it's also sort of extending the time of objects, right? Beyond their use value, right? So by combing through the streets of, picking up the garbage that other people had thrown away, Benjamin and his sort of rag picking protagonist give create a new sense of temporality, right? The hoarder as well, I think, has a kind of interesting approach to temporality, thinking about extending the life of the object beyond what it is actually useful, right? One of the distinctions we make between hoarding and collecting is also that hoarders hold on to objects long after their use is deemed to be over, right? So you hold on to trash, you hold on to, receipts that you no longer need. You keep papers or objects or even, food hoarding in these terrible, graphic shows on hoarding that you see. A lot of it is sort of food hoarding, which again, it's sort of rotten, going beyond the sort of time of the object. So I think temporality and time is very much critical to understanding all of these different forms of collecting. And I want to think a little bit more about how, especially thinking through this sort of martial dimension of collecting as a kind of temporal gesture. You also asked, I think, towards the end about what it is. Actually, could you reframe it? You asked about the history or the sort of historical import of, or would you mind restating the question? Okay. Well, in any case, I think there is not just a sort of temporal aspect, there's a historical aspect, right? Not just Benjamin's form of historical materialism, but a kind of historical model here that's being offered, and certainly something I want to think about. And I would sort of go back again for a minute to trash. And one of the interesting things when thinking actually about trash, and I was looking into this because I was sort of examining stooping, this kind of current phenomenon. You see stooping, it's actually taken over a whole Instagram handle of stoopers. who go and collect different objects. Stooping is actually technically sort of bending the rules, because according to New York law, when things are thrown out, it becomes the property of the city. So even things, I mean, you know, nobody's going to arrest you for stooping, but technically garbage, when it's thrown out, is no longer the property of the individual, but it's also not just up for the taking. So there's still rules and regulations on garbage and who's able to actually collect them. And that goes to gleaning as well. You know, I spend a whole section on Agnes Varda's Gleaners and I in the book, and there are very specific rules around gleaning, when you can actually glean the fruit. And there's a lot of rules even now in sort of supermarkets around when it is possible to sell the objects that are gleaned, right? Because of, you know, sometimes they pose health risks, or sometimes, you know, there is unaesthetic, right? So they're unable to be sort of sold. So even these objects, which are sort of discarded, still have rules around their collection, which I think is interesting to think about, even sort of property extending to refuse and sort of garbage. Anyway, maybe I'll end there on garbage. And open the floor.
We don't have a lot of time,
Oh,
but we can take a couple of questions for sure and bring in everybody a little bit. Yes. Oh, yeah.
Excuse me. Thanks so much. I had a question, or I was first a comment on chapter 3. Sorry. Yeah. No, you just bring in a term which is reoralization. Yeah, right. And that is basically what you say the collector can do or does. And well, one, I think that's really, really interesting. And I guess I'm just trying to figure out if you see that as being just actually bringing aura back, or if it's actually a different kind of aura that's happening there. I mean, I think it sort of is enlightening in the sense that it makes sense that, like, let's say we take the toys and now we suddenly see them in this new context, or we've decontextualized them, but we put them in a new context, right? We put them along these other toys and we see something new about the toys. And I guess that's what you mean by reoralization. Like, that there's something we're like noticing something about toys, or about these specific set of toys in this new light, which is like a certain distance, which then that makes sense in terms of aura. But it's also quite an individualistic aura in this case, the collector's sensibility that we're getting attuned to. And I take Benjamin's aura to mean something a little more social. And so I'm wondering how those two, if there's like a conflict or if there isn't one in your mind.
So I actually, this is sort of more of a comment, but I will try and keep it brief. I mean, I want to ask you what you think about it. So as I was actually listening to your debate with Andreas, because so that's a question that I've been thinking about quite a lot. So that is your debate about the relationship between what appears to be Benjamin's earlier practice of collecting as historicism and the idea of him as a historical materialist. So I mean, it strikes me that maybe the Arcades project, if we think about it as in fact treating the rags as sort of already being artifacts. So what I mean by that is that sort of collapses, the sort of linear progression that you have where something, is a rag and it's rubbish, and then it actually, becomes something auratic or something valuable, an artifact, right? So it's kind of getting away from that linearity. But it also strikes me that what Benjamin is doing is recontextualizing those pieces of trash, right? So he's putting them into some kind of new context. And I think that new context is, well, among other things, the structure of historical materialism, but also what he thinks is the structure of Paris itself. So because they become recontextualized in that way, I think, that's a way of kind of getting away from what seems to be this impasse between collecting as historicism, you know, which Benjamin is trying to get away from, and collecting as properly historical materialist. So if you like, what the collecting does is to show how in the fragments themselves, that underlying structure is already there. In the same way that in each fragment, its nature as potential artifact is already there, so to speak.
Hi. So obviously one of the predominant themes that we talked about in the Walter Benjamin class that Dr. Pfeifer taught was the concept in the Schmetterlingjagd, the butterfly hunt, which is this idea of the temporality at which one collects the item. So the idea of collecting butterflies, or this something that's moving through time itself, is that if you don't collect the butterfly, if you don't prematurely kill it in order to preserve it in its most like penultimately beautiful state, you kind of collect a degraded version of it. So the act of collecting actually sacrifices to a certain extent the potential of an item. And so I guess my question would kind of lean on this thing of, is the rag picker in a certain extent continuing a more revolutionary aspect because he's not appropriating in this kind of not reductive and reducing the complexity, but prematurely ending something's potential, that this rag picker is past the point of something having a kind of internal new potential, and therefore retransformation is its only possibility for like a new life, or an elongation of its being, versus the choice to collect something in this premature state without really knowing the kind of the full outcome of its internal teleology.
Oh, okay. Okay, it's super brief. I wanted to ask about like animal imagery in collecting and in relation to the rag picker, because I know we've talked about sort of the opposite in terms of sort of colonizing and appropriating tendencies. And I wanted to ask about like crows seeing shiny objects and any like animal imagery or metaphors that Benjamin uses to describe collecting. Okay, that's it.
And oh my gosh. Okay, the last. Just quickly, I don't have a long answer, but I'll keep thinking about it. I think it's an interesting question. I was just thinking as you asked your question about a description that Adorno has of Benjamin when he's collecting. He has the face of a badger or something. He describes it like Benjamin having almost a kind of animalistic affect. And I do think that's an important aspect of collecting as well. To think back through, not just collecting as a kind of human practice, but as something kind of foraging, right, or leaving leftovers, right? So certainly something to keep thinking about. And I'll just quickly try to get to how much time do I have, or how much not time do I have? Speaking of time. Okay. So the question about Aaron's question about the Schmetterling is also an interesting one, because yes, in fact, what collectors do, especially sort of the natural historical collecting, which is in some ways the kind of model of collecting, especially in the 19th century bourgeois childhood, you collected insects to learn about them, right? You collected specimens from nature and you put them into these little boxes, and that was how kids learned about the world. And that's very much also, I think, the model of collecting that Benjamin gives us in Berlin Childhood. But so yes, there's a kind of not only a sort of ceasing or taking out of, but there's a kind of killing of the object, right? Literally taking out of time, right? An object, cutting short the lifespan of an object that would have otherwise had, a very different kind of trajectory. So I think that's also an important aspect, which I wanted to highlight in this kind of dialectic, the very destructive aspect that involves not just, taking loot, but actually sort of taking an object and repurposing it and sort of thereby destroying it through the act of removing. That kind of reminds me of why so I didn't include Benjamin. I mean, I briefly referred to Benjamin's book collecting essay, but that's partly why I think Benjamin's book collecting is a bit different. And he says in his wonderful essay, Unpacking My Library, that the true book collector never reads the books that he or she has, right? Because a real collector treats books like objects, right? Also useful to think about when you're thinking about my book. You can collect it, but not read it, right? And so in some sense, the book collector is the consummate book collector is the collector who takes an object out of circulation and never actually uses it, right? And that's, if you think of money collectors or stamp collectors, right? Those are precisely, this is the way that collectors take these objects out of circulation and bring them into the collection, and thereby sort of stopping maybe this is some way of getting at, I realized I never answered Bruce's question about money. But maybe that's one way of also bringing it back to money in some sense. And then there was another question on aura, and maybe this is where I'll end, and I will still think about your question as well on the historical materialism. But just quickly, aura is, of course, the central term that Benjamin uses in the work of art essay. But I think thinking a little bit more interestingly, where also Benjamin talks about aura is in his sort of essays on Baudelaire, where aura becomes about the object looking back at you, right? Aura is about the kind of intersubjective relationship between the collector and the object, right? That isn't just about us looking at something, but it's about the imagined life or the kind of perspective that the object has. So it's literally a sort of taking out of, takes one out of oneself in some sense. And so when I think about aura and reorganization, I think that, aura is typically often read in the work of art essay as something sort of conservative, these like lamenting the decline of, right? But if you think about it in this sort of more generative term, I think aura becomes something that can be reimagined, right? There's not one single aura, right, that has to remain, right? And a lot of what Benjamin writes about is the Nachleben, right? The afterlife of these objects, which then take on new aura as they become sort of collected or inhabited by different people. So aura as kind of shifting from this sort of kind of conservative idea of something privileged, right? Okay, you go into the temple, you see, the aura of the deity reflecting back to a kind of more open-ended form of aura. Anyway, sorry, I think that was too long, but thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you again, Annie. And